It's the classic love story. Composer gets dumped, composer plots revenge, composer is stopped at the border because the guard wonders why he's got an inexplicable French maid costume packed. All of which is only true if you believe the composer's memoirs, which you definitely shouldn't. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about Hector Berlioz. Hector Berlioz was born in December 1803 to a Catholic mother and an agnostic father, and it was through his mother's wishes that he was baptized into the Catholic Church, although his adult beliefs would more align with his father's. Berlioz was a hopeless romantic, having had his first crush on the girl next door when he was 12 and she was 18. The music that he wrote for her marked the beginning of his musical career. Unlike a great many other composers, he never really had a particular musical training in his childhood up until that point, and his eventual musical training came on the flute and the guitar, and he learned all of his compositional techniques through the study of textbooks. He never learned how to play the piano, and this means that a lot of his harmonic procedures used in his mature music are very idiomatic to the guitar, but don't really make so much sense on the piano. This helps give his music a unique flavor. Much of what we know of Berlioz's personal life comes from his own memoirs, which are highly entertaining but never under any extent to be trusted. Though the general accounts are correct, the details are often so embellished as to be unbelievable. This includes the account of his escape from medical school, where he was sent off against his will when he was 18 years old. According to his memoirs, he saw a human cadaver being sliced open, and he said nope, and he jumped out the window, running down the street to the conservatoire, never to set foot in the medical school again. The reality was that he left the medical school much slower. It took him about 3 years to eventually change and study music full-time. Of course, he wasn't necessarily the greatest of students, given his flighty temperament and his less musical than most background. On one occasion, the director of the conservatoire, Luigi Cherubini, wanted him kicked out of the library. But Berlioz was committed to the idea of writing music. Large music. That was going to be his calling card. These massive orchestras and these massive productions, with as many instrumentalists and as many singers as he could possibly get. In his eventual treatise on instrumentation, Berlioz would peg the size of his ideal orchestra at nearly 1,000 musicians. Berlioz would come to butt heads with Cherubini on a professional level later on, but he always held his music in high esteem. Berlioz also held an absolute obsession with winning the prestigious Prix de Rome, which he did after 4 attempts, and this gave him a much-needed half-decade-long stipend. Remember how I said that Berlioz was a hopeless romantic? Well, he went to see a production of Shakespeare's Hamlet, and playing Ophelia was the Irish-born actress Harriet Smithson, and Berlioz fell in love hard and fast. This really wouldn't have been that much of a problem, except he was super creepy about it. He constantly bombarded her with letters and showered her with praise, at one point even moving apartments, just so he could occasionally catch a glimpse of her going in and out of her apartment building, and once in a blue moon, if her window was open at night, watch her fall asleep. Dude! Let's just say that she really didn't care for the attention. In any event, his love for her led to his breakout composition, the Symphonie Fantastique, or Episodes in the Life of an Artist. This was an astounding achievement not just for its scope in 5 distinctly programmatic movements, but also for its orchestrational techniques. In order to achieve his effects, he needed an orchestra larger than most stages could handle. In fact, he actually had to move the date and time of the premiere when he realized that the stage was not big enough to handle the orchestral size that he required. The plot of Symphonie Fantastique revolves around the artist, an idealized version of Berlioz himself, and his obsession with a recurring melody known as the idée fixe, which is a representation of his idealization of the beloved. The beloved being, of course, Harriet Smithson. Over the course of the piece, the protagonist falls in love, realizes that his beloved does not love him, takes opium, don't try this at home, kids, believes that he has killed her, is sentenced to death, watches his own head get guillotined off, and then is sent to hell where his beloved is now in the form of a witch who taunts him, as if you needed another reason not to do drugs. The use of the idée fixe is an element of what we might call cyclic form, where there is one motivic idea that innately relates all of these separate movements, and it's one of the things that Berlioz does to help keep the piece together. While bits and pieces and elements of established formal design dot the 5 movements of the symphony, it is in the finale that Berlioz especially throws all of these asunder and lets his plot and his plot alone determine the structure of the piece. There had been programmatic pieces, sure, but this was the programmatic piece, intended to be so tied into its narrative that the piece would be incomprehensible without it, according to Berlioz himself. However, Berlioz was not above changing the plot and changing the program to suit his needs, especially his romantic interest at the time, as we will soon see. For what it's worth, the piece does work even if you don't know the actual plot behind it. The irony of Berlioz's romantic life was that, while he was still desperately in love with Harriet Smithson, he was engaged to a lady who was decidedly not Harriet Smithson. Her name was Marie Moch, and she ended up marrying Camille Pleyel of piano manufacturing fame. When Moch's mother sent Berlioz a letter saying that her daughter had broken off their engagement, Berlioz became so enraged that he hatched a plan. He purchased 2 pistols, an outfit so he could dress up as a woman, and he planned on sneaking into their house, killing his ex-fiancée, killing her mother, killing poor Camille Pleyel, who had absolutely nothing to do with this, and then killing himself. Again, this all goes back to Berlioz's own memoirs, so please take this with several grains of salt. This, of course, never happened, which was a great thing for all involved. But let's just remember that this was his secondary romantic interest. He wasn't even as in love with this lady as was possible for him to be in love. In any event, because he had won the 1830 Prix de Rome, he was required to spend at least 2 years in Rome, which he didn't care for. He seemed to like Italy in general, I mean, who wouldn't? But he didn't like Rome, and the longer he stayed there, the more it seemed to grate on his nerves. He fulfilled the requirements of his 2-year residency, but he escaped to the countryside as often as possible, and he moved back to Paris as soon as that was possible as well. While in Rome, he met the young Felix Mendelssohn, who was traveling around Europe in order to finish up his education, and the two became friends, despite writing completely different music and not sharing anything in terms of temperament or in religious views. They did, however, bond over their shared dislike of Roman musical culture, which they both found very lacking. Mendelssohn gave him a baton as a token of his affection, and is quoted as saying that Berlioz was more sensible than his music. The Symphonie Fantastique had taken on a life of its own when his friend Franz Liszt, who was friends with pretty much everybody, transcribed it for solo piano. And it was through this version that critics such as Robert Schumann knew of the piece and hailed it as a masterpiece. Yet Berlioz was unafraid of adapting or tweaking his own program in order to suit his needs, this time because he wanted to write a sequel. This came in the form of the orchestral song cycle / choral symphony entitled Lelio, or Return to Life, as Berlioz altered the plot of Symphonie Fantastique to make the pipe dream an actual real occurrence within the narrative, so that the journey to hell was not just a bad dream, but rather something that actually happened, in order so that the plot of Lelio could bring the artist back to life. This finally grabbed the attention of Harriet Smithson when she realized that the piece was about her. The composer and actress finally met, and by the next year, 1833, were married. This was a horrible idea. As it turns out, infatuation does not a relationship make, and they were completely opposite people. They could not have been worse for each other. What's worse is that they couldn't even communicate. She did not speak French, and he really didn't speak English. Berlioz's next big piece was Harold in Italy, a symphony / concerto with a prominent solo viola part, albeit one that is couched within the orchestra as opposed to a soloist in front of it. This was commissioned by the virtuoso violinist Niccolo Paganini, who wanted something flashy to show off his viola chops on his Stradivarius viola. The problem is that Paganini commissioned a composer who wanted to break the rules. As you might have noticed, nearly all of Berlioz's works break the few rules and customs not already torn asunder by Beethoven. Berlioz's best works exist at the confluence and the combination of several forms, and Harold in Italy is no exception. It's not really a symphony, but it's also not really a concerto. It's a combination of the two. Paganini took issue with this because the viola part wasn't as technically challenging as he was looking for. He was looking for something really flashy and concerto-like, and he was also looking for something where he played more than he actually did in the piece. He wanted to be playing nearly all of the time, and that's not what Harold in Italy is about. As a result, he did not play in the premiere. Yet after his premiere, so the legend goes, Paganini realized his mistake, bowed down before Berlioz, and bequeathed to him 20,000 francs. And I can't find a good way of translating this into modern currency, but that is a whopping amount of money. They also bonded further over their shared passion for the guitar, something that was a more intimate instrument to the usually outgoing and flamboyant Paganini. Berlioz was also at this point deeply unhappy with how conductors dealt with his music, and in order to present the best version of his pieces to the public, he decided that he needed to become a conductor in his own right. This got off to a rocky start as the press published these scathing and insulting caricatures of Berlioz at the podium. But once he got his feet underneath him, he was actually quite good at it, and this helped him become an even better orchestrator than he already was. When he was alive, he was better known as a conductor than as a composer, the same fate which would befall Mahler at the end of the century. His tours of Russia proved especially fruitful as he was friends with Mikhail Glinka, the grandfather of Russian music. The money there was especially lucrative because Russia had little to nothing in the way of a unique musical identity. He was, however, due to several political factors, unable to ever hold down a full-time position as a conductor. He was only ever a guest conductor anywhere he went. He also got a gig as a music critic, and although this kept the cash flow up, and despite his witty way with words, he never enjoyed it. Paris seemed to have had enough of him, and so he spent a large majority of his time conducting his own works throughout Europe. This did not leave him much time to actually work on his own compositional projects. Not only was he considered an eccentric, and his genre-busting pieces an acquired taste at best, but they require so many performers that actual performances, not to mention good performances, were very few and far between. Take, for instance, his Requiem, which he considered his magnum opus. This requires 8 bassoons, 4 tubas, a relative newcomer, and 16 timpani, which makes a little more sense given the actual limitations of the instrument at the time. There's also 4 antiphonal brass choirs situated in various points around the audience, which means even more tubas. The 4 tubas I mentioned earlier was just the orchestral forces. It didn't even count these other choirs. Not to mention the 108 strings and 210 chorus members involved. As if this wasn't enough, he actually instructs that these are to be proportional forces, and that if there was space, you could actually augment these forces so long as the proportions stayed the same. This piece is almost impossible to mount nowadays. You just need too many performers. Most orchestras would go broke. In any event, he was highly attuned to matters of orchestration and instrumentation, and published one of the first textbooks on the subject in 1844. He would then revise this later, and then there would be another version that would be revised by Richard Strauss. I actually have this. It's right over there. This was published in the same year, in which he led a performance of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony with 1,022 performers. One can now begin to understand why Symphonie Fantastique is one of the few Berlioz pieces that is still played with any regularity by symphony orchestras. And this, in fact, originally called for 220 performers. That's what Berlioz wanted at the premiere, even though he only managed to get 130. He was a great conductor once he actually learned what he was doing, and he was eager to learn from those with more knowledge on the subject than himself. He wasn't just someone who would jump in the deep end and pretend that he knew everything about the subject when he really didn't. All of his works are for large orchestras. Not a single solo or chamber piece survives, although he did write these in his earliest years. These were either destroyed or lost, or their material ended up reincorporated into a larger work. One of the reasons he wanted to conduct his own music is telling as to how he actually envisioned his music, vis-a-vis the music of the past. Conductors were used to showing phrases that were of more regular length, 4, 8, 16 bars. And Berlioz rarely, if ever, writes a 4-square melody a la the classical style. It sounds odd and wrong in the context of the music he wrote, and he did not trust conductors to spend the adequate time necessary to study his scores and show what needed to be shown in order to make the music truly sing. Of course, given the sheer scope and scale of what he wanted, he sometimes required the services of up to 5 subconductors just to keep these huge forces together. She had taken to drinking heavily after the collapse of her acting career, and she suffered a series of recurring strokes that left her immobile, and she was tended to by a squad of servants paid for out of Berlioz's own pocket. Berlioz, of course, immediately after their separation, moved in with his longtime girlfriend Marie Riccio, whom he officially married after Harriet's passing. Berlioz was long at odds with the press, and once conducted an experiment by presenting a piece that he wrote under a different composer's name, a composer who didn't actually exist. Not only did the critics love it, but the usual anti-Berlioz crowd loved it because it was specifically not written by Berlioz. Because he was such a polarizing figure, critics had a hard time actually judging his music on its own merits. Not only this, but even fans of Berlioz today don't always like all of his pieces because they're so vastly different. You can be a fan of one piece and not find so much merit in another. It's possible to do this with Berlioz because his pieces are so different from one another. Many of Berlioz's later years were committed to the composition of one of the biggest operas ever written, Les Troyens. I'm probably completely mispronouncing that. This is how it's spelled. This was a summation not just of his skills as a libretto writer, as a composer, and as an orchestrator, but also a summation of everything he loved about literature, because he was a very well-read composer. Despite the fact that what his vision required far outpaced anything that was even remotely practically possible in Paris or even the rest of Europe, he kept going with it, and he kept writing what he wanted to see and what he wanted to hear. Performances had to come in reduced versions, which did not capture the immensity and the grandiosity that he was going for. Although the Petit Opera originally agreed to do it, it was dropped in favor of Wagner's Tannhäuser. And when Wagner is easier to perform than your piece, you know you've written a pretty extreme piece, because Wagner is not known to be easy to produce, because of the scope and scale involved in his productions. Berlioz's opera was a flop, not for the music itself, but rather the extenuating circumstances of actually getting it performed. It never made it into the repertoire, and is now only occasionally, perhaps once a decade, revived for the modern stage. It was never performed complete in Berlioz's lifetime. After the death of his second wife and his two sisters, he fell into a deep depression where he felt very alone. When he got word that they were going to renovate a section of the city and pave over his first wife's grave, according to his own memoirs, he exhumed her body himself and made sure that it was reinterred in a final resting place. Which again, grain of salt, it's his own memoirs. He was probably not really serious about this, or at least it was highly exaggerated. After his son Louis died of yellow fever in Cuba in 1867, Berlioz burned most of his surviving correspondence, leaving only a few mementos, including a guitar given to him by Niccolò Paganini and his Mendelssohnian baton. Further adding to his suffering was the continued onset of a mysterious gastrointestinal illness, which left him racked with pain. He died in Paris in March 1869, at the age of 65, and was buried alongside the bodies of both of his wives. The effect that Berlioz had in his own time and immediately after his death is much more profound than one might expect. He introduced the term choral symphony and defined its values in the post-Beethoven's Ninth era, for Beethoven's Ninth was, of course, the first true choral symphony. His orchestrational techniques and conducting styles in particular were highly valued by the emergent school of Russian nationalist composers, as embodied in the so-called Mighty Handful. One of the members of the Mighty Handful was Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, who is considered one of the greatest orchestrators of all time, and he credited a lot of what he knew about orchestration to his study of Hector Berlioz's works. The so-called 3 Bs of music was a term first coined to encompass Bach, Beethoven, and Berlioz, even though it didn't achieve an actual wide popularity until Berlioz was replaced by Brahms, to create a more linear school of Germanic composition, as opposed to sticking a Frenchman in there with 2 Germans. Franz Liszt and Richard Wagner supported Berlioz enthusiastically, and saw him as an ally in their form-breaking approaches. Liszt, who can be credited with the invention of the symphonic tone poem, saw a similar artistic outlook and love of literature specifically in the work of Berlioz. Like, well, pretty much everyone, he saw Beethoven as the fundamental starting point, likening him to the Shakespeare of music, although Berlioz was never confident enough in his English skills to be able to read Shakespeare, one of his favorite authors, in his original language. Like the music of Gustav Mahler, it was only ever really championed in the composer's lifetime by the composer himself when he was on the podium, and it took a concerted effort on the part of music directors in the mid-20th century to bring Berlioz's music back from the brink and into the conversation as one of the true great masters of the art. While he was able to rake in a not insignificant amount of money through his lucrative conducting tours and his music criticism, he funneled almost all of this back into basically bankrolling his own performances. During his lifetime, he was always more highly regarded outside of France than within it. Not everyone liked Berlioz, though. In addition to the conservative Parisian critics with whom he would regularly spar, he also was considered a pretentious blowhard by many, the many being those whose music he did not particularly like. A critic from 1852 wrote that Berlioz matches instruments that howl when they meet. He thunders, He rages without lightning and without storm. He is bizarre and ill-ordered because he lacks inspiration and knowledge, violent because he has no good reasons to offer, and he wishes to stun us because he does not know how to charm us. He was a stereotypical romantic in that he had strong opinions, and he believed very passionately in them, and he was willing to fight for them. For that, it's easily understandable how he would cut a polarizing figure in the earliest days of Romanticism. But without him, the styles and forms that would come to define the rest of the era would have been vastly different.